Hey, ever wonder why torture, executions and other types of physical punishments were more common in the pre-modern past than they are today? Although some things can be attributed to our modern ideals about human rights and avoiding suffering, as well as modern ideals about democracy and respect for individuals, the truth of the matter is that there are several other factors that also contributed to corporeal punishments being less used. First of all is that in most pre-modern societies throughout history, prisons, instead of corporeal punishments, were not a viable alternative, as prisons require resources such as buildings to house prisoners, guards to guard the prisoners, and food to feed both the prisoners and the guards guarding. And that has nothing to do with the additional costs and administration issues of administrating a prison, or several prisons as you will need in a bigger political framework or kingdom. And all of these resources needed also need to be administrated by an administration and controlled by an administration, which means that you need to have the institutions necessary to have a prison system. And those in turn require a strong state, which was rarely the case in pre-modern times in much of the world. And prisons does not appear as a more normalized way of punishment until at least in the 15th century in Europe, and even then in the beginning it was not that common. But with the increased strength of the states in Europe and the development of new, stronger institutions and stronger states, prisons became more common. But during most of pre-modern times, harsh, shorter punishments were both quicker and required less oversight than prison, and were thus preferred. On the subject of being quicker, that might have been even more important, as quick punishments meant less time spent during the punishment, and meant that most people that were involved in farming during pre-modern times could go back to work the fields without interruptions, as farming, especially farming in the past, if it was interrupted, would have taken enormous efforts to resume again if the process of cultivating the fields was ever disturbed by the absence of a farmer. Thus, minor physical punishments, such as whippings or minor beatings, were preferable even for the convict in the case of minor crimes, as it made it so that he would not have to sacrifice his entire livelihood through his absence from the fields in most cases. And this is the reason as to why you can see in early Islamic jurisprudence within the Shafi school that imprisonment should be avoided, and that it's better to do lighter whippings or other types of physical punishments for lighter infractions. A third reason as to why physical punishments were used a lot in the past instead of, for example, monetary compensation for minor crimes is that money in the past was actually pretty rare. Most transactions in the past, in pre-modern times, were actually the exchange of wares rather than based upon the exchange of money. And even taxation systems in the past largely took taxes in the payment of goods rather than money in many cases. Although goods and property other than money were taken as a sort of punishment in a lot of pre-modern justice systems, there still existed the issue about goods not being equivalent to each other. So in order to standardize punishments, a lot of systems of the past just used corporeal punishments instead, because 5 whippings are still 5 whippings, for example. Whereas there would appear more problems with judgments and legal procedures if you had to discuss if 5 sacks of wheat were equivalent to a sheep or not in terms of payment as a punishment. Not to mention that people might not even have any goods to pay with at all. But pain from physical punishment is still a punishment that can be delivered. So corporeal punishments here were a result of convenience in a lot of cases. Then we have the fourth factor, and that has to do with rehabilitation and punishment. And that is that in the past, the aim of punishment wasn't so much to rehabilitate criminals, but to scare them. And the reason for this goes back to the term rehabilitation, which goes back to the term in Latin habitus, the habit of what you are supposed to do. And the idea of rehabilitation is to bring you back to doing good, or to bring you back to function according to the norms of society, through reminding you that you have actually broken the correct habitus of society, that you have done wrong in society. However, the issue arises that most societies in the pre-modern past, before modernity, were clan societies, where clan loyalty was seen as the ultimate good. What is good for the clan is what is good. That is your habitus and what you strive for. Thus, you can't really rehabilitate someone in a clan society by pointing out that they have done wrong if the reason as to why they did a crime was due to clan loyalties, as that is considered a righteous action and not something to be pointed out as being wrong in the eyes of the convicted criminal. And that just leaves you with punishment and fear to deter issues. And that leads to the next point, and that is that clan societies often require revenge between clans as well, because it's not about singular individuals in clan societies, but about dynamics between various clans and their associates. Thus, harsh physical punishments in the open of certain members of certain clans when they have done wrong is a way to avoid creating spirals of revenge between groups. The justice system steps in and punishes individuals harshly in order that it just remains certain individuals that are punished and not devolves into a long-standing clan feud where even greater amounts of people will get hurt. This function of the law to have harsh punishments in order to avoid greater clan conflicts is also why adultery and breaking of marriage contracts, which were usually based upon familial agreements between families, as marriage was a sort of formalization of alliances between families in the past, were punished so harshly in many law systems that have their origins in pre-modern times. By having harsh punishments for adultery or other actions that could cause greater clan conflicts, and having these demonstrations in the open through official, public, corporeal punishment, honor could be maintained among clan families and conflicts could be avoided. It would have been hard to create a legitimate soft law that did not result in greater instability in a lot of pre-modern societies. Also, a lot of pre-modern societies did not really have the same concepts about legitimacy as more modern societies have in the law, as the focus of power in most pre-modern societies was on the local clans. Thus, systems of punishment in various pre-modern societies that were imposed from far away had to compensate for this lack of legitimacy with greater brutality, often expressed in physical punishments or brutal types of executions. Especially if the society that has the law imposed upon it has recently been conquered or has a massive amount of differences between various groups, such as slaves or some other sort of subservience present in the system, which was common in the past. In such a case, fear and strong punitive actions are the only options in such a society, as you don't have an automatic reverence for the law as being the standard of behavior in these societies, except through punishment. And this is why you see so much torture and public executions in the past, with, for example, crucifixions, impalements, gladiator games, and so on. Many of these torturous types of executions not only brought fear, but they also brought great humiliation upon their victims. But they were also a spectacle for people to watch, which brings me to the next reason. Public executions and public corporeal punishments of other types were a sort of entertainment that people liked to watch and also could be used as a diversion from troubles, sometimes intentionally used by rulers. in order to divert public attention away from various failures, or in order to spread their own propaganda and to get good PR. For example, the Roman gladiator games, but also public executions and tortures in the later medieval period were deemed a spectacle, where people could see criminals get brutalized in various ways and or shamed with, for example, the use of the pillory and other sorts of exposure in order to bring shame. And this element of bringing shame and making the public view the spectacle of viewing someone get shame brought upon them is also very important in clan societies, where the majority of livelihoods and advancements and securities are through informal agreements and social interactions and bonds. Destroying the reputation of a person through, for example, humiliating him publicly destroys thus the base for these agreements and these connections. Thus, this is an element to types of corporeal punishments that is often overlooked, but was very important in the past as a type of harsh deterrence. And you don't get this kind of humiliating shame or this sort of spectacle that draws in crowds to watch it as entertainment if you imprison someone. And this is the end of this short video about physical punishments and executions and why they were more common in the past. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشتركوا بالقناة في فضلكم.